Sometimes, the people we least expect are the ones who can surprise us the most. It's truly heartbreaking when it doesn't surprise you in a good way. However, very rarely is it life and death. Needless to say, I'm sure it was a horrible surprise for young girls of modern-day Slovakia and Hungary between the years of 1602 and 1609 to find out that their promised job opportunities of servitude and maidship were all a ruse, and instead they would become prey, tortured, humiliated, and murdered. These poor women suffered in service to their master, a woman of nobility who was brought up in a remarkable house and given all of the advantages in life a person could want or need. But she lusted for two things above all others: suffering and blood. Her torturous methods were inhumane and cruel. Between torture and murder, she would affect the lives of a reported 650 young girls between the ages of 10 and 14. Some victims even believing her to have a thirst for virgin blood in pursuit of the believed fountain of youth. Because of this, she will be forever remembered as one of the worst serial killers in history. I'm your host, Nick, and this is Chapter 24 of the Insidious Agenda podcast, the story of Erzebet Bathory, the Blood Countess. In the year 1560, a young girl named Erzebet Bathory was born to a noble family in the town of Erzebet in Hungary. Elizabeth was the daughter of the local Baron George VI and mother Baroness Anna Bathory, who resided in Erzebet Castle. Her brother was the highest-ranking military member of the royal line in Transylvania, a person bearing the title of Voivode. He was Andrew Bonaventura Bathory. Through their royal lineage, Elizabeth was the niece of Stephen Bathory, a man with many titles. He was the King of Poland, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and the Prince of Transylvania. As a child, Elizabeth was plagued by an illness known today as epilepsy, as she would often be a victim of seizures. At this time, those afflicted with epilepsy had what was known as falling sickness, for which the only known remedies were rubbing the blood of someone who didn't have the illness on the lips of an epileptic. Alternatively, after seizures were complete, the two sets of blood could also be mixed and orally administered to the individual by way of a piece of skull. Elizabeth's family were Calvinist Protestants. Through her religion and education, she was exposed to the languages of Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. Also, being of a royal line, she was born into great wealth, which gave her the opportunity to have a great education paired with a high. Elizabeth was also considered to be extremely beautiful. More or less, Erzebet Bathory had every advantage in life she could possibly dream of. When she was only 10 years old, Elizabeth was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy. This, like many marriages of the time, were held to create a political allegiance rather than being born from love. In order to finish her education, she was sent to live with her future husband's family. During this period, Ferenc spent a great amount of time away training, either in Vienna or near the Hungarian border at many of the local garrisons. During Ferenc's time away, it was rumored that Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. Unfortunately, she was not married, and her new family, fiancé included, would not stand for this. The child's father and Elizabeth's lover were reported to be a peasant boy. History tells two different versions for what happened to that child. The first tells that the child, who who was a boy, was taken from her and given to a local woman whom the family trusted. For her care of the child, she was remunerated and moved with the child to a region known as Wallachia in Romania. The second will turn your stomach. It was said that her future husband ordered the child to be castrated and then thrown into a pit with the dogs, where it was torn to pieces. Both of these stories are deemed to be extremely unlikely, as at her age and future important marriage looming, she would have been looked after and guarded extremely closely. Also, being of nobility, it's highly unlikely she would have risked her pride or the importance of her future marriage on someone less than nobility. The couple were married on the 8th of May in 1575 at the Palace of Verano. It was said that their wedding was attended by over 4,500 guests. And of course, it was filled with all of the splendor you can imagine. 3 days of feasting full of hog roasts, salutes, dancing, banquets, and military parades. Due to the holdings of their family, Erzebet and her husband's combined land ownership now spread over both Transylvania and the Kingdom of Hungary. Ferenc would gift to his wife the castle of Countess near Kecse, a castle nestled in the Little Carpathian Mountains, which lay between the modern-day towns of Nové Mesto ved Váhom and Trenčín in Slovakia. Originally, the castle was purchased by Ferenc's mother, Orsolia Kanizsai, in 1569 and was transferred to Erzebet on marriage, along with a country home and 17 surrounding villages. As she also outranked her husband, Erzebet was permitted to retain her surname while her husband would take it on. The couple would reside at Countess Castle, but split their time with Ferenc's former residence at Sarvar. Throughout the course of their relationship, Ferenc was away for extended periods of time. He was a military man, often leaving to battle the rival Ottoman Turks during the Ottoman-Hungarian Wars. He was an ambitious soldier, taking over as chief commander of Hungarian troops in 1578. His conquests would help secure the castles of Esztergom, Weizen, Visegrad, Székesfehérvár, and Győr in the Kingdom of Hungary. He would also fight alongside famed Hungarian Nicholas Palffy, one of the kingdom's top military commanders at this time. Ferenc was known for his courage on the battlefield, but was infamous for his cruelty in treatment of Ottoman prisoners, which earned him the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary. It was because of this time away that the couple wouldn't give birth to their first child until 10 years into their marriage, the first of 5 over a period of 10 years. The child was a daughter named Anna, who was born in 1585 and would later become the wife of Nicola VI of Croatia. The others were Orsolia, Catalin, Andres, and Paul. 2 of their children would pass away, Orsolia and Andres, as infants. All of the couple's children were raised by governesses, like Erzebet was. For those unfamiliar with the term, governesses during this period were women employed in the family home to serve the purpose of being teachers and mentors rather than caretakers. During her husband's time away, Erzebet would fill her days looking after the residents and managing business-related affairs or their various estates. She oversaw the responsibility and provision of medical care for both the Hungarian and Slovak peoples during the period known as the Long War from 1593 until 1606. Erzebet was also responsible for the defense of her husband's estates as they lay on the route to Vienna. Her husband would make no complaint of her handling of things, as it was said she did so with surety and maturity. She was known to have at least once intervened on behalf of destitute women for a woman whose husband was captured by the Ottomans, and another woman who was raped and impregnated. This was due to the fact that the village of Kecse lay on the border between the royal and Ottoman-occupied areas of Hungary, which would of course lead to that area being in great danger of attack. Because of this, at some point during their marriage, Erzebet is believed to have been taught and become skilled in the art of torture from her husband Ferenc. Her husband even constructing a torture chamber to his wife's specifications in order to show his love to her. She was also known to have taken a handful of lovers during her time alone. In 1601, Ferenc began to experience some sort of pain emanating from his legs, and by 1603, he became permanently disabled, passing away on the 4th of January in 1604 while in the midst of battle. His exact cause of death is unknown, but it's believed to be from complications of whatever lower body injury he suffered from. After his passing, all of Ferenc's wealth and property passed to Erzebet until the coming of age of his heir, Pal, who was only 9 at the time. After her husband's death, things began to take a dark turn for Erzebet, and she was reported to have taken a liking to dark magic. She began to grow cold and demanding towards her servants, and would often find company in women older than herself. It was through a servant named Anna Darvulia where she would learn the art of spellcraft and the brewing of potions and poisons. Anna claimed to be able to brew elixirs that could make anyone who took them as beautiful as the sun and alluring to men. Word began to spread of wicked, sadistic things happening at the castle. The rumors would begin as early as 1602. The early reports came from young peasant women who stated that Bathory had a love for abusing, torturing, and even murdering young girls who were promised opportunities as maids or servants in her castle. These girls were usually between the ages of 10 and 14. It was only after the death of her husband in 1604 that these rumors would begin to grow even more widespread, and on more than one occasion, she was accused of kidnapping girls of non-noble families outright. The allegations were not only made by servant and peasant girls, but would soon begin to come from noble girls of lesser houses, who were being sent to Ketcha to be educated and instructed by Bathory. If you're a bit squeamish, I highly recommend fast-forwarding the episode if you don't want to hear some of the things Bathory did to her victims. I'll leave a note of the time in the show notes when it's safe to continue. You have been warned. Erzebet Bathory's torturous methods were not limited to beating or physical abuse. She preferred many more sadistic, horrible methods. But that being said, she did not shy away from beating these girls with clubs, often to death. She would often burn her victims with hot irons and other instruments. In the dead of winter, she would strip the young girls naked, pour ice water over them, and leave them outside in the cold to freeze to death. She was also known to cover her victims with honey and stake them to the ground outside where their exposed skin would be feasted on by various insects and where they could easily be stung by bees. Erzebet was known for her love of needles and would so shut the lips of any girls who spoke or were deemed to cry out too loudly during their torture. She would also drive those needles under the fingernails of her young victims to cause excruciating pain. Her favorite method of torture was horrible because of her love of scissors. She would use them to mutilate the faces and bodies of her victims. She cut off hands, noses, and even used them to mutilate genitals. Erzebet would even use the scissors to cut clean the webbing between fingers and toes. There was also a report made that Bathory forced one of these servant girls to cut off pieces of herself and then cook and eat them. This was not the end to the horrible things that she had done. The remainder lie in the realm of the supernatural. For Erzebet, Bathory was believed to be humanity's worst vampire. She believed that she needed the blood of young girls in order to sustain herself and her beauty. To do this, she would drink the blood of virgins and often bathe in the blood of her victims, biting chunks out of their faces and breasts. Bathory is believed to have come to this revelation when she slapped one of her female servants in a fit of rage, and noticed that her skin looked younger when the victim's blood covered it. Several witnesses also claim to have seen Bathory make a pact with and even engage in intercourse with the devil. Though the claims of her vampirism are often challenged, they don't appear in any written text over the next century after her death. Nonetheless, it would be from these stories she was given the nickname the Blood Countess. Historians believe that the stories were invented to explain her behavior, as the common understanding at the time was that women couldn't be violent simply for violence's sake. It wasn't until the complaints began to come from nobles that the reports were looked into. The reports from peasant girls and servants had gone largely ignored. During the period of her believed torturous reign, between 1602 and 1610, a Lutheran minister named Istvan Magyari would file formal complaints against Elizabeth at the court of Vienna. In 1610, the King of Hungary and future Holy Roman Empire Matthias II would assign Georgi Thurzo, a nobleman, and the Count Palatine of Hungary to investigate the reports. In turn, Thurzo would order two notaries, Andras Karachuri and Moses Chiraki, to gather evidence against Bathory. By October of that year, they had collected 52 witness statements. The following year, that number grew to 300. The stories of her torture and murder were told to the notaries, attesting that Bathory had a hand in or directly tortured and murdered over 600 girls with the assistance of her servants. Many of the bodies of the executed victims were buried in various graveyards around the castle and at many unmarked locations. Owing to the strong testimony, the matter was brought before Nicola VI Zerinsky, the husband of Bathory's daughter Anna. He agreed with the case brought forward by Thurzo and believed that Elizabeth should be imprisoned and her estate divided and distributed. On the 30th of December in 1610, under orders from Thurzo, Elizabeth Bathory was arrested along with 4 of her servants, Dorothea Semtesh, Iana Jo, Katerina Benica, and Janusz Ujvari. Janusz was also the only one who was male. These 4 were charged with the deaths of 80 girls. Her other accomplice, Anna Darvulia, had passed away the year before, in 1609. The arrest wasn't as clean-cut as it should have been. Thurzo, in a letter to his wife, outlined that the arresting party had recovered a body of one of Bathory's victims that predeceased their arrival, and was able to save another girl who was believed to have been Elizabeth's current victim and was chained up in the castle. Though often believed that Bathory was in the midst of torturing this poor girl, she was actually arrested while in the middle of dinner, though Thurzo would proclaim to guests and other villagers that he had caught her literally red-handed. It was confirmed afterwards that Bathory and her accomplices were arrested prior to the discovery of the other girls. There was a report that Bathory kept a diary in which she recorded the names of all 650 of her victims, but this report appears to have been fictionalized. Either that, or the list has been lost to history. There were also other nobility implicated in the crimes, nobles such as Lady Anna Welliker and Ladies Judith Pogan and Lady Tsell. These 3 were reportedly shepherds or girl catchers for Bathory and would often travel further and wider to find new servant girls as the local population began to dry up. These noble women, however, were never tried on these reports. Thurzo would discuss the next steps with Elizabeth's son Paul and her 2 sons-in-law, Nicholas VI and Georgi Drugeth. The family professed that their wish was not to lose the family property, which was at risk of being seized by the crown. They had also discussed the possibility of sending her to a nunnery. However, it was deemed she was too high of a target for local populations. Erzebet Bathory was never tried, owing to her status as a noble, but she was imprisoned within her castle, in a room that was bricked up with no windows. This was the same reason why the reports against her had not been taken as seriously as they should have been: her noble status. Her servants did not get off as easily as she did. Their court proceedings would be held on the 2nd and 7th of January in 1611. Many witness accounts were dropped, testifying that they heard accounts secondhand, so that they were not credible in court proceedings. Confessions were obtained from each of Bathory's servants under torturous methods. Normally, these would not have been admissible in temporary court, but nonetheless, at this time, they held up, and the servants were all convicted. The two with the worst sentences were Iona Jo and Dorothea Countess. Their punishment was having their fingers ripped out, one by one, with red-hot pincers, following which the pair were burned at the stake, having been found guilty of murder and witchcraft. Owing to the fact he was younger, thus less involved, Januszwary was executed by beheading. Katerina Benica received a life sentence because of the fact evidence was presented showing she had been the victim of abuse by the other servants. It's unknown whatever became of her after her sentence. A fifth servant, Erzebet, initially was able to evade her captors, but was eventually caught and burned at the stake like Iona and Dorothea. The entirety of the findings against Bathory was word of mouth. There was never a document produced by any local person that complained against her. Common practice at the time dictated that any legal offense would have to have a letter of complaint drafted. Even the high figures of her murderous reign were embellished by a servant named Susanna, stating to the court official Jakob Silvasi that she had seen the number and names in one of Bathory's private books. However, the book was never found, and Silvasi never testified to its existence. Thurzo would write a letter to King Matthias on the 25th of January, informing him that Bathory had been arrested and her servants executed. She would be detained in the castle for the rest of her life. Though she was reported to have done all of those horrible things, there are differing reports. The first was that she was not only confined in a bricked-up room, but allowed to freely roam the castle, thus being more or less sentenced to house arrest. Her sentence would not officially come into effect until the 29th of December 1611. The second version is that after her sentence, she was bricked up in the room with only slits for air and food. One of the reasons historians believe that house arrest was accepted by the king was that Matthias owed a very large debt to the Bathory family. They would agree to cancel it if he accepted a sentence of house arrest. In addition, it would allow the family to state the reports against her were politically motivated and slanderous, allowing the family to appropriate her lands and wealth as they saw fit. Thurzo once joined a group of Elizabeth's relatives on a visit to her castle. She would profusely request a trial, however, she was refused. She promised that there would be dire consequences for his illegal actions. His only response to her was, "You, Erzebet, are like a wild animal. You do not deserve to breathe the air on earth or see the light of the Lord. You shall disappear from this world and never reappear in it again." It was much easier to brick her up than to drag her family through what would be a trial of high status and become a precedent for allowing monarchy to dispose of other nobility that they deemed inconvenient. Erzebet passed away only 3 years after learning her fate, just days before her 54th birthday on the 21st of August, 1614. In September of 1610, Elizabeth had written a will in which she would leave all her current and future inheritance to her children. This document was signed a month preceding her death in 1614. The evening before she died, she complained to her bodyguard that her hands were cold. He dismissed her and told her to go lie down. She was found dead the following morning. Initially, her body was buried in the churchyard at Secce on the 25th of November in 1614, but because of public outcry, her remains were later moved to her childhood home at Erzebet, being laid to rest in the family crypt. The descendants of both Elizabeth and Ferenc were banished from the Kingdom of Hungary and would come to reside in Poland. Though members of the family would return to Hungary after 1640, this was effectively the end of the Bathory dynasty line in that country's royal lineage. The story of what really happened with Elizabeth Bathory will always be shrouded in mystery. Let's begin by examining what we know. She was born into an extremely well-off family and had many more advantages than others of her time. Elizabeth was well-educated and even spoke multiple languages. Her marriage was politically motivated and would segue into one of the most wealthy and highest land holdings in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her husband, Ferenc, was a military man in very high standing, cunning, and ambitious. After his death, she absorbed all of his wealth and land holdings, becoming even more powerful and influential in the area. We know that her family was owed a great deal of money from the ruling Habsburg dynasty of Hungary during her life. It's entirely possible that King Matthias II agreed to a lesser sentence and the future appropriation of her lands by other family members, in agreement for dissolution of that debt. In addition, it would keep one of the country's ruling families out of the spotlight from drawing the ire of their subjects. For Elizabeth's part, it was known that she was abusive towards her subjects, so this could have possibly been where the stories of her cruelty and extreme torture truly stemmed from. Also, the majority of witness accounts that were gathered by Thurzo were second-hand and not actually directly involved with any proceedings or torturous methods she may have carried out. She was an extremely wealthy woman, with no husband by her side for the later years of her life. If we wanted to draw a conspiracy, we could easily see something could exist between the Bathory family and the king. Her sons-in-law knew of her arrest and the proposed sentence before any of the dominoes actually started to fall. Their chief interest was not the serving of justice for her victims, but how they would hang on to her money and her lands. Not once in this entire story were the victims actually factored in. Their witness statements were taken, however it remains to be seen if any of them were remunerated for any loss of life their families endured. There is nothing said or reported about these victims, only stories from witnesses. The other interesting cases were the stories of torture and murder that Elizabeth was reported to have taken part in, and the belief vampirism may have played a factor in some of these. All in all, Elizabeth Bathory likely did horrible things to her servants. Whether she was indeed the blood countess as she was reported to be remains to be seen. Her servants were tortured in order to obtain confessions and would ultimately pay the price for the crimes of witchcraft and Elizabeth's ambitions. There existed politically motivated ideas for wanting to slander and accuse Elizabeth of these horrible things, but the thing truly fascinating about her story and the reports of her horrible, sadistic behavior is that they had to come from somewhere. If they are to be believed, then Elizabeth Bathory would go down in history as one of the worst, most sadistic killers of all time. To put things in perspective and finish this episode, I'll leave you with a few quotes. The first is Elizabeth's thoughts on her life. "I wish that I had been born a man. I would have killed thousands in battle, taken over countries, and burned witches. I would have been a hero." The second comes from author S.R. Knox. "Darkness terrified her, not because she was fearful of monsters lurking in the shadows, but because it awakened the monster within her." So here it ends, the tragic story of Erzebet Bathory, the Blood Countess, and if believed to be, her many victims. It truly was a terrible, tragic story both in terms of the victims who suffered abuse, drawing the ire of Erzebet herself, and for the Countess, who was never convicted of anything and left to spend her last days alone, bricked up in her castle with her family's only concern being how they were going to break up her lands for their own benefit. I hope you enjoyed this week's story, and I wanted to thank you very much for listening and choosing to come back to my podcast. For those of you who saw the schedule released this month, you know that there's a special bonus episode coming your way on Christmas Day. I don't expect many to tune in to listen on Christmas Day with all the hustle and bustle going on, but nonetheless, it'll be there for you during your holiday break whenever you're ready. It's the next iteration of our Folklore Appendices series, when I discuss the dark reflection of St. Nicholas, the demonic beast known as Krampus. And of course, we'll be back next Tuesday for our regular episode, when we'll discuss the terrifying happenings that inspired the film Open Water, the story of the disappearance of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Before you go, remember to subscribe, turn on your notifications, or even just give us a thumbs up or a quick review. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for coming back.